The autumn wind whispered through the towering spires of Helios Institute, carrying with it the weight of impending change. None of the brilliant minds rushing through its hallowed halls could have predicted how one man's defiant challenge to divinity would spiral into an event that would shake the very foundations of their scientific understanding. In the world of empirical evidence and cold hard facts, what transpired that fateful evening would leave even the most steadfast skeptics questioning everything they believed to be true. Before we dive into this extraordinary tale that blurs the lines between science and faith, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss the moment when one of the world's most renowned scientists faces something that his equations and theories could never explain. The gleaming glass and steel facade of the Helios Institute of Advanced Sciences pierced the crisp autumn sky like a modern cathedral to human achievement. Dr. Lysander Ravencroft's footsteps echoed through the polished corridors as he made his way to his laboratory, his usually composed demeanor betraying a hint of agitation. The latest issue of Quantum Frontiers was clutched tightly in his hand. His own article on the mathematical impossibility of divine intervention prominently featured on the cover. At 45, Dr. Ravencroft had become one of the most respected and controversial figures in theoretical physics. His piercing violet eyes and prematurely silver hair gave him an almost otherworldly appearance, fitting for someone whose work challenged the very foundations of religious belief. The walls of his office were adorned with prestigious awards and groundbreaking publications, each one a testament to his ruthless pursuit of empirical truth. "Dr. Ravencroft?" A gentle voice interrupted his thoughts. Zephyr Thallow, his youngest research assistant, stood in the doorway, his olive complexion paled by concern. "The Celestial Observatory called. They're requesting you reconsider participating in next week's symposium on science and spirituality." Lysander's laugh was sharp and bitter. Reconsider? They're the ones who need to reconsider clinging to medieval superstitions in an age of quantum mechanics and artificial intelligence. He tossed the journal onto his desk, where it landed beside a framed photograph turned face down, a detail that didn't escape Zephyr's observant eyes. "Perhaps there's value in dialogue," Zephyr ventured, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Professor Kalian Ambrose will be leading the discussion, and his work on consciousness and quantum entanglement." "Ambrose?" Lysander spat the name like it left a bad taste in his mouth. "A brilliant mind wasted on mysticism and philosophical nonsense. No, Zephyr, I won't dignify their attempts to reconcile science with fairy tales." Down the hall, Dr. Vesper Halcyon paused in her tracks, overhearing the conversation. Her dark eyes narrowed with concern. As the Institute's head of ethics in scientific research, she had watched Lysander's growing hostility toward religion with increasing unease. "Then what will you do?" Zephyr asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lysander turned to the wall-to-wall windows overlooking the sprawling campus of Astralgate University below. The ancient spires of the university's chapel stood in stark contrast to the modern research facilities surrounding it. His reflection smirked back at him as a plan formed in his mind. "I'll give them exactly what they want," he said, his voice taking on an edge that made Zephyr shift uncomfortably. "I'll attend their precious symposium, and I'll present irrefutable evidence that will demolish every argument for the existence of a higher power. It's time someone had the courage to say what needs to be said." The news of Lysander's intended participation spread through the academic community of Emberfall like wildfire. Within hours, social media was ablaze with speculation and debate. The small town, nestled in the shadow of the Lumeria Valley's towering mountains, had never seen such controversy within its prestigious academic institutions. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the Helios Institute's grounds, Professor Kalian Ambrose sat in his study at the Celestial Observatory. The elderly professor's weathered hands traced the spine of an ancient text as he contemplated the coming storm. His eyes, still sharp despite his advanced years, focused on a curious phenomenon through his window, a ring around the moon that seemed to pulse with an unusual intensity. "You cannot fight fire with fire, old friend," he murmured, thinking of his former student's planned challenge. "Some truths cannot be captured in equations alone." Meanwhile, in his penthouse apartment overlooking Emberfall, Lysander stood before his floor-to-ceiling windows, practicing the speech that he believed would change everything. The face-down photograph on his desk held a secret that drove his mission, a personal tragedy that had set him on this path of determined atheism years ago. What none of them knew, not even Lysander himself, was that the events about to unfold would shake not just their understanding of faith, but the very foundations of science itself. The autumn wind continued to blow through Emberfall, carrying with it the whispers of impending change, as the stage was set for a confrontation that would leave an entire audience in awe. Little did they know, in the quiet corners of the celestial observatory, ancient instruments were recording anomalies that defied explanation, as if the universe itself was preparing to respond to Lysander's challenge. The morning of the symposium arrived shrouded in unusual weather. A thick blanket of fog had settled over Emberfall, wrapping the celestial observatory's copper domes in an ethereal mist. Inside the historic building's grand lecture hall, tension crackled like static electricity before a storm. Dr. Vesper Halcyon stood at the entrance, greeting arriving academics and religious leaders with practiced diplomacy. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, matching her pressed charcoal suit, armor for the battle of ideologies she knew was coming. When Professor Calian Ambrose arrived, leaning slightly on his worn wooden cane, her professional smile softened into something genuine. "Professor, I'm concerned about today," she confided, falling into step beside him. "Dr. Ravencroft has been different lately, more aggressive, more absolute in his positions." Ambrose's eyes twinkled with an wisdom that belied their sharp intelligence. "The loudest denials often mask the deepest questions, my dear. I've known Lysander since he was a brilliant young graduate student, before the accident that took his—" "Professor Ambrose." The booming voice of Reverend Cassian Moonshadow interrupted their conversation. The tall, striking figure of the Reverend approached, his traditional clerical collar contrasting with his modern, tailored suit. "I trust you're prepared for today's discussion?" "As prepared as one can be when dealing with matters of the infinite," Ambrose replied with a gentle smile, "though I suspect today may hold surprises for all of us." Inside his private preparation room, Lysander Ravencroft was making final adjustments to his presentation. Zephyr Thylo hovered nearby, watching his mentor with growing concern. The young assistant had never seen the professor so intense, so focused on destruction rather than discovery. "Dr. Ravencroft," Zephyr ventured, "I've been reviewing the quantum fluctuation data from last night's observations, and there's something unusual." "Not now, Zephyr," Lysander cut him off, his fingers flying over his laptop keyboard. "Whatever anomalies you've found can wait. Today, we're putting an end to the comfortable delusion that science and faith can coexist." The young assistant fell silent, but his hand touched the unusual data printouts in his pocket. The Celestial Observatory's most sensitive instruments had recorded something unprecedented during the night, patterns that seemed to defy the very laws of physics that Dr. Ravencroft was planning to use in his arguments. As the lecture hall filled, Dr. Theron Nightshade, the department head, took his seat in the front row. His reputation for political maneuvering was as well known as his brilliant mind, and he watched the gathering crowd with calculated interest. Beside him, Dr. Orion Blackthorn, Lysander's longtime academic rival, wore a smile that suggested he was anticipating entertainment rather than enlightenment. Astria Vale, a promising doctoral candidate, slipped into a seat near the back, her tablet ready to record every moment. Her research into the intersection of quantum mechanics and consciousness had been inspired by both Ravencroft's mathematical precision and Ambrose's philosophical insights. Today, she felt caught between two worlds she desperately wanted to reconcile. The fog outside seemed to thicken as the hour approached, pressing against the tall windows like a living thing. The ancient heating system creaked and groaned, creating an unsettling accompaniment to the murmur of gathered academics and theologians. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Professor Ambrose opened the symposium with characteristic grace, his voice carrying easily despite its gentleness. "We gather today not as opponents, but as seekers of truth. Science and faith have long been viewed as contradictory paths, but perhaps they are more like two eyes viewing the same reality from slightly different angles, giving us the depth perception we need to truly understand our universe. A polite applause followed his words, though several attendees, including Dr. Blackthorne, made their skepticism clear with raised eyebrows and exchanged glances. The tension in the room ratcheted higher as Lysander Ravencroft approached the podium, his presentation remote, clutched in his hand like a weapon. "With all due respect to Professor Ambrose," Lysander began, his voice sharp with barely contained disdain, "I'm not here to find comfortable compromises between science and superstition. I'm here to demonstrate through rigorous mathematical proof that the very concept of divine intervention is incompatible with our understanding of quantum mechanics and causality." The first slide appeared on the massive screen behind him, complex equations that promised to dismantle centuries of religious thought. But as Lysander launched into his presentation, something strange began to happen. The sophisticated projection system, despite its multiple backups, started to flicker. The equations on screen seemed to shift and dance, though everyone present would later swear they saw different variations of this phenomenon. Zephyr, watching from the wings, pulled out his data printouts with trembling hands. The patterns he'd observed in the quantum fluctuation data were intensifying, centered on the lecture hall itself. It was as if reality was becoming less stable, less certain, with each passionate declaration from Dr. Ravencroft. "The universe operates according to immutable laws," Lysander continued, his voice rising with conviction. "There is no room for divine intervention, no space for miracles in the clockwork of cosmic reality. What our ancestors attributed to gods, we now understand through equations. What they saw as miracles, we recognize as natural phenomena." As if in response to his words, the lights in the lecture hall dimmed momentarily and a low hum filled the air. Not from the building's systems, but from somewhere else, somewhere indefinable. Professor Ambrose leaned forward in his seat, his eyes sharp with recognition of something the others had yet to grasp. The stage was set for what would become known as the Emberfall incident, a moment when the boundaries between science and faith would blur in ways that would challenge everything Dr. Lysander Ravencroft thought he knew about the nature of reality itself. The peculiar humming in the lecture hall grew more pronounced as Lysander clicked to his next slide, revealing a series of wave function calculations that he claimed definitively proved the impossibility of supernatural intervention in quantum events. But something was wrong. The numbers on the screen weren't behaving as they should. They seemed to shift and rearrange themselves subtly, a phenomenon that drew confused murmurs from the scientifically trained members of the audience. "As you can see," Lysander continued, his voice carrying a hint of strain as he noticed the anomaly, "the Copenhagen interpretation clearly shows—" He stopped abruptly, frowning at his presentation. The equations were no longer matching his prepared notes. From his seat, Professor Calian Ambrose watched with an expression of profound interest, his aged hands folded calmly in his lap. Unlike the others, he showed no sign of confusion or concern at the strange occurrences. Instead, a slight smile played at the corners of his mouth, as if watching a long-anticipated event unfold. Dr. Vesper Halcyon stood up from her seat, her scientific training warring with what her eyes were telling her. "Dr. Ravencroft, are you seeing this?" she asked, gesturing to where the mathematical symbols on screen were now definitely moving of their own accord. Lysander's jaw tightened. "A technical malfunction," he declared, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. "Nothing more than an electrical anomaly or perhaps a corrupted file." He pressed the remote forcefully, attempting to move to the next slide. Instead of advancing, the presentation suddenly filled with rapidly scrolling data, strings of numbers and symbols that looked remarkably like the quantum fluctuation readings Zephyr had tried to show him earlier. The young assistant pulled out his own tablet, his eyes widening as he compared the patterns. They were identical. "Dr. Ravencroft," Zephyr called out, his voice shaking but determined. "These patterns, they match the anomalous readings from the observatory's quantum sensors last night, the ones I tried to tell you about." Lysander's face flushed with anger. This is ridiculous. Someone is clearly attempting to sabotage my presentation. His eyes darted accusingly to Dr. Orion Blackthorne, who raised his hands in mock surrender. "Don't look at me, Ravencroft," Blackthorne drawled. "Even I couldn't hack your system this elegantly, though I must say watching you flounder is rather entertaining." Professor Ambrose rose slowly to his feet, leaning on his cane. "Perhaps, Dr. Ravencroft, the universe itself is trying to tell you something. Your equations are correct, but your conclusions." He gestured to the screen where the numbers continued their strange dance. "Reality appears to be suggesting a different interpretation." "Nonsense," Lysander snapped, his composure cracking. "This is exactly the kind of mystical thinking that has no place in scientific discourse. These are clearly coordinated technical difficulties, nothing more." But even as he spoke, the strange phenomena intensified. The temperature in the lecture hall dropped suddenly, causing breath to mist in the air. The quantum data on the screen began forming patterns that, as Dr. Astria Vale would later write in her thesis, displayed impossible levels of non-random organization suggestive of conscious intervention. Reverend Cassian Moonshadow stood, his tall frame commanding attention. "Dr. Ravencroft, in all my years of theological study, I've never witnessed anything quite like this. Perhaps we should—" "Enough!" Lysander slammed his hand down on the podium. "I will not stand here and let superstition and technical glitches derail years of rigorous scientific work. The universe operates according to fixed laws, laws that I have spent my career documenting and proving. There is no room for divine intervention, no space for your God in the equations that govern reality." The moment the words left his mouth, every electronic device in the lecture hall went dark. The backup generators hummed to life, only to fail immediately. In the sudden silence, the strange vibration that had been building became impossible to ignore. It seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once, setting teeth on edge and causing the ancient windows to rattle in their frames. Then, in a moment that would be debated in scientific journals and theological texts for years to come, every piece of scientific equipment in the lecture hall, from simple calculators to complex measuring devices, began displaying the same sequence of numbers. A sequence that, as Dr. Theron Nightshade would later reluctantly admit in his official report, corresponded exactly to the mathematical expression of the golden ratio, appearing spontaneously and simultaneously across all digital displays. Lysander stood frozen at the podium, his carefully constructed worldview crumbling in the face of something he couldn't explain. The face-down photograph in his office flashed through his mind. The image of his late wife, herself a brilliant physicist, who had always urged him to consider that science and faith might be two sides of the same coin. Professor Ambrose's voice cut through the chaos, calm and clear. "In all my years of studying both scientific principles and spiritual teachings, I've observed that the universe has a way of challenging our most rigid certainties. Sometimes, Lysander, the most profound scientific discoveries come when we admit that our current understanding may be incomplete." The humming reached a crescendo, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything returned to normal. The lights came back on, the presentations returned to their original state, and the temperature normalized. But the atmosphere in the lecture hall had changed irrevocably. The line between what was scientifically possible and what had just occurred stretched credibility to its breaking point. In the stunned silence that followed, Zephyr approached the podium with his data printouts, laying them gently beside Lysander's trembling hands. The readings showed clear, undeniable patterns in the quantum field surrounding the lecture hall, patterns that, by everything they understood about physics, should have been impossible. The symposium that had been intended to definitively separate science from faith had instead produced something unprecedented, a moment where the two seemed to converge in ways that demanded both scientific investigation and philosophical contemplation. As the audience sat in shocked silence, it was clear that this was only the beginning of a much larger story, one that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the nature of reality itself. The hours following the unprecedented events at the Celestial Observatory passed in a blur of confusion, debate, and furious scientific documentation. Dr. Lysander Ravencroft sat alone in his office at the Helios Institute, surrounded by printouts of data that defied every natural law he had devoted his life to proving. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the face-down photograph on his desk, finally turning it upright. The image showed a younger version of himself with his late wife, Dr. Elena Ravencroft, both wearing their lab coats and smiling in front of the large Hadron Collider. Elena's eyes sparkled with the same curiosity about the universe that had first drawn them together. "There are more mysteries in heaven and earth, Lysander," she used to say, quoting Shakespeare with a knowing smile. "Science is our way of uncovering them, not disproving them." A gentle knock at the door interrupted his reverie. "Come in," he called out, his voice hoarse from the day's events. Professor Calian Ambrose entered, his presence somehow making the cluttered office feel more spacious. He moved with deliberate grace despite his age, settling into the chair across from Lysander, without waiting for an invitation. "The preliminary readings from our quantum sensors are quite fascinating," Ambrose said, placing a tablet on the desk between them. "Dr. Vale's analysis suggests we witnessed something akin to a controlled collapse of multiple quantum states, something that should be theoretically impossible on a macro scale." Lysander ran a hand through his silver hair, his scientific mind warring with what he had witnessed. "There has to be a rational explanation, perhaps a sophisticated hack, or an environmental anomaly we haven't identified yet." "Is that what you truly believe?" Ambrose's eyes held no judgment, only genuine curiosity. "Or is that what you need to believe to maintain your current worldview?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Outside the office, they could hear the excited voices of students and faculty still discussing the events of the symposium. News had spread quickly through the academic community, and already social media was buzzing with speculation and amateur theories. "You knew, didn't you?" Lysander finally asked, looking directly at his former mentor. "You knew something would happen today. That's why you were so calm when everything started going haywire." Ambrose smiled enigmatically. "Let's say I had. A strong intuition. The universe has a way of responding when we make absolute declarations about its nature, especially when those declarations come from minds as brilliant as yours." Down the hall, in one of the advanced physics labs, Zephyr Thalo and Dr. Vesper Halcyon were running continuous scans of the lecture hall, trying to document any residual effects from the incident. The young assistant hadn't left his post since the event, his dedication to understanding what had occurred overriding his need for rest. "Look at this pattern," Vesper said, pointing to a recurring sequence in the data. "It's almost like it was deliberately designed to be noticed," Zephyr finished her thought. "The mathematical precision is beyond anything we've ever recorded in natural phenomena." Dr. Orion Blackthorne burst into the lab, his usual smugness replaced by genuine excitement. "Have you seen the recordings?" Every device in the lecture hall captured the exact same anomalies, from different angles and using different technologies. This rules out any possibility of isolated equipment malfunction. Meanwhile, in the Celestial Observatory's ancient library, Reverend Cassian Moonshadow and Astria Vale were poring over historical records, looking for any similar incidents in the past. The Reverend's theological texts lay open alongside modern physics journals, creating an unusual but fitting juxtaposition. "There," Astria said suddenly, pointing to a dusty tome. In 1887, during a lecture on electromagnetic theory at Cambridge, the instruments began displaying impossible readings, and witnesses reported seeing Maxwell's equations writing themselves in the air. "The account was dismissed as mass hysteria," Cassian noted, reading further. "But the mathematical descriptions of what they witnessed, they're remarkably similar to what we saw today." Back in Lysander's office, the conversation between him and Ambrose had reached a crucial point. The elderly professor leaned forward, his voice gentle but insistent. "You've spent years trying to disprove the possibility of divine intervention, Lysander. But ask yourself, what if you've actually been documenting evidence of something greater all along? What if the mathematical perfection you've discovered in quantum mechanics isn't evidence against a higher power, but evidence of one?" Lysander stood abruptly, pacing to the window. The fog that had shrouded Emberfall all day was finally lifting, revealing a sky painted in impossible shades of purple and gold. "You sound like Elena," he said softly, almost to himself. "Ah, yes, your wife." Ambrose nodded. She had a remarkable ability to see the harmony between scientific precision and cosmic mystery. Perhaps today's events were a reminder of her perspective. A soft beeping from Lysander's computer drew their attention. Dr. Theron Nightshade had just sent the official preliminary report on the incident to all senior faculty members. Opening it, Lysander felt a chill run down his spine as he read the clinical description of events that defied clinical description. "The department is calling for a full investigation," he said, scanning the document. "They're already assembling a team of international experts. This could change everything we think we know about quantum mechanics, about the nature of reality itself." Perhaps that was the point, Ambrose suggested, rising slowly to his feet. "Sometimes we need our certainties shaken to make room for greater understanding." He paused at the door, looking back at his former student with compassion. "The question is, Lysander, are you ready to consider possibilities beyond your current mathematical models?" As the elderly professor's footsteps faded down the hall, Lysander found himself once again looking at the photograph of Elena. The events of the day had shaken him to his core, forcing him to confront questions he had been avoiding since her death. What if there really was more to reality than what could be captured in equations? What if his quest to disprove the divine had actually led him to the threshold of something far more profound? The sun was setting over Emberfall, casting long shadows through the Helios Institute's corridors. In labs and offices throughout the building, scientists continued to analyze data from the incident, each discovery raising more questions than answers. And in his quiet office, Dr. Lysander Ravencroft began to consider that perhaps the greatest scientific discovery of his career would be admitting how much he still had to learn about the true nature of the universe. Dawn broke over Emberfall the next morning, bringing with it a day unlike any other in the town's history. News vans lined the streets outside the Helios Institute, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like modern prayers. Inside his apartment, Lysander Ravencroft hadn't slept. The events of the previous day played on endless loop in his mind, along with memories he'd long tried to suppress. He stood in his home office, surrounded by walls of academic achievements that suddenly felt hollow. His hand trembled as he opened a drawer he hadn't touched in years, pulling out a worn leather journal, Elena's research diary. The last entry was dated just 3 days before the accident that took her life. "Breakthrough in quantum entanglement experiments today," he read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. "The patterns we're seeing, they're too perfect, too intentional. Lysander doesn't want to see it, but there's something here beyond random chance. The universe is trying to tell us something." A knock at his door startled him from his reverie. Through the peephole, he saw Zephyr Thallow clutching a thick folder and wearing the same clothes as yesterday. Clearly, he hadn't slept either. "Dr. Ravencroft," Zephyr burst out as soon as the door opened. "I've been cross-referencing the quantum fluctuation patterns with Dr. Elena's old research papers. The similarities are... Well, you need to see this." Lysander felt his chest tighten. "What did you say about Elena's papers?" "I'm sorry. I know I shouldn't have accessed the archived files without permission," Zephyr said, spreading documents across Lysander's coffee table. "But after yesterday, I remembered something Professor Ambrose once mentioned about your wife's final research project. Look at these wavelength patterns." Side by side, the readings from yesterday's incident and Elena's final experiments showed an unmistakable correlation. The same mathematical sequence, the same impossible organization of quantum events. "She was right," Lysander whispered, sinking into his chair. All this time she was right. Across town at the Celestial Observatory, Professor Ambrose was holding an emergency meeting with Dr. Vesper Halcyon and Reverend Cassian Moonshadow. The usual rivalry between scientific and religious institutions had been temporarily suspended in the face of something that challenged both worldviews. "The media is demanding answers," Vesper said, rubbing her temples. "And the university board is breathing down our necks. They're concerned about the institution's reputation. Truth cannot be contained by concern for reputation, Cassian replied, his deep voice resonating in the observatory's circular chamber. What we witnessed yesterday demands honest investigation, regardless of where it leads us. Professor Ambrose stood by the observatory's main telescope, his aged fingers tracing the ancient brass fittings. "There's something else," he said quietly. "Something I should have shared long ago. It concerns Lysander Ravencroft's final research." Both Vesper and Cassian leaned forward, intrigued. The circumstances surrounding Elena's death had always been shrouded in mystery. "She came to me the week before she died," Ambrose continued. "She had discovered something in her quantum research, something that suggested consciousness itself might be intertwined with the fabric of reality in ways we never imagined. She was afraid of what it meant, of how it would be received by the scientific community." "What exactly did she discover?" Vesper asked, her scientific curiosity piqued. "Evidence that quantum events weren't random at all, but responsive to conscious intention. Not just human consciousness, but something larger, something more fundamental to the universe itself. She called it the divine algorithm." Meanwhile, at the Helios Institute, Dr. Orion Blackthorne was making a discovery of his own. Reviewing security footage from the day of Elena's accident, he noticed something that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. The quantum measurement equipment had recorded the same anomalous patterns moments before the laboratory explosion that took her life. Astria Vale, working late in the Institute's library, was piecing together her own theory. She had found references in ancient theological texts to phenomena remarkably similar to what they had witnessed. Moments when the physical and spiritual worlds seemed to intersect in mathematically precise ways. Her phone buzzed with a message from Zephyr. "Found something in Elena's papers. Meeting at Dr. R's apartment. Come quickly." Back in his apartment, Lysander was experiencing a profound shift in his understanding of reality. Elena's journal revealed a side of her research he had never known about, or perhaps had chosen not to see. She had been mapping the intersection of science and spirit, finding evidence of design in what he had dismissed as random quantum noise. She wasn't just studying quantum mechanics, he told Zephyr, his voice thick with emotion. She was developing a mathematical framework for understanding consciousness itself, not just human consciousness, but universal consciousness. What we might call God, Zephyr suggested quietly. Before Lysander could respond, another knock came at the door. This time it was Dr. Vesper Halcyon, her face grave. "We need to talk about Elena," she said as she entered. "Professor Ambrose just shared something troubling about her final research, and Dr. Blackthorne has found new evidence about the day she died." The room grew still as Vesper shared what they had learned. With each revelation, the events of yesterday's symposium took on new meaning. The impossible quantum patterns, the synchronized displays, the mathematical messages, they weren't just random phenomena. They were connected to Elena's work, to her final discovery. "She tried to tell me," Lysander said, picking up the photograph of them together. "She kept saying that her research was leading her to something extraordinary, something that would change everything we thought we knew about consciousness and reality. But I was too afraid of what it meant, too committed to my own beliefs." As night fell over Emberfall, the group gathered in Lysander's apartment realized they were on the verge of something unprecedented, a discovery that could bridge the gap between science and faith, between the physical and the spiritual. But with that realization came a chilling question. If Elena's research had led to her death, what forces might they be unleashing by pursuing it further? The answer would come sooner than any of them expected, and it would shake their understanding of reality to its very foundations. The pre-dawn hours found the unlikely group still gathered in Lysander's apartment, surrounded by Elena's research papers and printouts from the symposium incident. Coffee cups littered every surface, and the first rays of sunlight were beginning to peek through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across their tired faces. "Look at this," Astria said, holding up one of Elena's diagrams. She wasn't just theorizing about quantum consciousness, she was mapping it. These patterns show up in ancient religious symbols, in the golden ratio, in the very structure of the universe itself. Lysander leaned forward, his eyes red from lack of sleep, but burning with intensity. The diagram showed an intricate series of interconnected mathematical equations, forming a pattern that seemed to pulse with its own life in the early morning light. "It's a blueprint," he whispered, recognition dawning on his face. "Not just of quantum interactions, but of consciousness itself." Elena found a way to mathematically represent the connection between mind and matter, between observer and observed. Dr. Vesper Halcyon was pacing the room, her usual composure showing cracks. But why would this research have led to her death? What about this discovery was so threatening? "Perhaps it wasn't the discovery itself," Professor Ambrose said from his position by the window, where he had been quietly observing. "Perhaps it was what it implied about the nature of reality, and who might want to control that information." A heavy silence fell over the room. Zephyr, who had been inputting data into his tablet, suddenly sat up straight. "Dr. Ravencroft, look at these readings from the observatory's quantum sensors. They're active again, showing the same patterns as yesterday, but this time they're centered." "Here," Lysander finished, feeling a strange vibration in the air. "They're centered here." The lights in the apartment flickered, and every electronic device in the room began displaying the same sequence of numbers they had seen at the symposium. But this time, something was different. The numbers were changing, evolving, forming what appeared to be a message. Dr. Orion Blackthorne, who had been skeptically observing from the corner, stepped forward. "Those coordinates," he said, pointing to a repeating sequence. "They're pointing to somewhere in the celestial observatory." Reverend Cassian Moonshadow, who had remained silent for much of the night, spoke up. "In all my years of studying religious texts, I've never seen anything quite like this. It's as if science and divine revelation are converging into a single language." Lysander felt a familiar presence in the room, something he hadn't experienced since Elena's death. It was the same feeling he used to have when they were working together, on the verge of a breakthrough. His hands trembled as he reached for Elena's journal again, turning to the final pages. "There's more here," he said, his voice barely audible. Elena wasn't just researching quantum consciousness. She was trying to prove that consciousness survives physical death, that it's a fundamental property of the universe itself, not just a product of brain activity. "Like a cosmic hard drive," Zephyr suggested, his eyes wide. "Storing information, storing consciousness, in the quantum fabric of reality itself." Professor Ambrose nodded slowly. "Many spiritual traditions speak of an Akashic record, a universal repository of all knowledge and experience. Elena may have found a scientific framework for understanding such concepts." Astria, who had been quiet for some time, suddenly gasped. "The anomalies we've been recording, they're not random episodes, they're attempts at communication. Something, or someone, is trying to reach across the boundary between consciousness and physical reality." As if in response to her words, the temperature in the room dropped dramatically. The quantum readings on Zephyr's tablet spiked, and a soft, pulsing light seemed to emanate from Elena's research papers. "We need to go to the observatory," Lysander said, standing up with sudden determination. "Whatever Elena discovered, whatever she was trying to tell us, the answer is there." Dr. Vesper Halcyon checked her phone, frowning. "The media circus is still camped outside the Institute. How do we get there without drawing attention?" "I know a way," Professor Ambrose said, his eyes twinkling. "The observatory has old maintenance tunnels connecting it to various parts of the campus. They were used during the Cold War for secure access. Few people know about them now." As they gathered their materials, preparing to leave, Reverend Cassian approached Lysander. "You know what this means, don't you? If Elena's research is correct, if consciousness truly exists independent of physical form, then everything I've believed about the nature of reality, about the impossibility of a higher power." Lysander couldn't finish the sentence. "Science and faith might not be as incompatible as you thought," Cassian said gently. The group made their way quietly down to Lysander's private parking garage, where Professor Ambrose directed them to take 2 vehicles to avoid attention. As they drove through the quiet streets of Emberfall, The sun was rising fully now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Lysander, driving the lead car with Zephyr beside him and Astria in the back, felt a strange sense of peace despite the magnitude of what they were pursuing. For the first time since Elena's death, he felt truly aligned with his purpose as a scientist, not to disprove the existence of greater mysteries, but to understand them. The celestial observatory loomed ahead, its copper domes gleaming in the morning light. Somewhere within its walls lay the key to understanding Elena's final discovery, and perhaps to bridging the gap between science and faith that Lysander had spent so long trying to widen. What none of them realized was that they weren't the only ones interested in Elena's research. In a darkened office at the Helios Institute, Dr. Theron Nightshade was making a phone call. "They're on the move," he said quietly, "and they have the research papers." The chase for truth was about to become a race against time. The ancient maintenance tunnels beneath the Celestial Observatory echoed with their footsteps as Professor Ambrose led the group through the dimly lit passageways. The air was thick with decades of undisturbed dust, and their flashlight beams caught the occasional glimpse of old scientific equipment abandoned during the Cold War era. "Elena used to come down here," Professor Ambrose said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She said the quantum readings were clearer underground, away from surface interference. I never understood why until now." Lysander touched the rough stone walls, feeling a faint vibration that seemed to pulse in sync with his heartbeat. Zephyr's quantum sensors were going haywire, displaying readings that defied conventional physics. "The patterns are getting stronger," Zephyr reported, his young face illuminated by the glow of his tablet. It's like the whole tunnel system is one giant quantum antenna." Dr. Vesper Halcyon stopped suddenly, holding up her hand for silence. Did anyone else hear that? They all froze, listening intently. A faint sound echoed through the tunnels. Not their footsteps, but something else. Something that sounded almost like distant music, but at frequencies that seemed to vibrate at a cellular level. "The harmonics," Astria whispered, her eyes wide with recognition. Elena's papers mentioned quantum harmonics, specific frequencies that could potentially bridge the gap between physical reality and consciousness itself. Reverend Cassian pulled out a small, worn notebook. "There are ancient texts that speak of sacred sounds, vibrations that could connect the physical and spiritual realms. We always assumed they were metaphorical. Perhaps," Professor Ambrose said thoughtfully, "our ancestors simply lacked the scientific framework to describe what they were experiencing." They continued deeper into the tunnel system, following both the sound and the increasingly intense quantum readings. Lysander felt a growing sense of anticipation, mixed with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It was as if every step was bringing him closer not just to understanding Elena's work, but to Elena herself. Dr. Orion Blackthorne, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke up. "The radiation readings here. They're identical to those recorded in Elena's lab the day of the accident. We need to be careful. Or perhaps," Lysander said, his voice steady, "we need to be ready. Elena wasn't killed by an accident. She was on the verge of proving something that would change everything, and someone wanted to stop her." The tunnel opened into a large circular chamber that none of them, not even Professor Ambrose, had known existed. The walls were covered in complex equations and diagrams, hand-drawn in what Lysander immediately recognized as Elena's writing. In the center of the room stood an array of custom-built quantum measurement devices, their displays dark but somehow expectant. "This was her secret lab," Lysander breathed, running his hands over the equations. "Everything she couldn't tell me, everything she was afraid to share with the world. It's all here." Astria was already photographing the walls, her face alight with academic excitement. "These equations, they're beyond anything in her published work." She was mapping the mathematics of consciousness itself. Zephyr approached one of the old devices, his technical expertise evident in his careful examination. "These aren't standard quantum sensors. She modified them to detect something specific, something that normal equipment wouldn't register." Professor Ambrose stood in the center of the room, turning slowly as he took in the full scope of Elena's work. She wasn't just theorizing about the connection between consciousness and quantum mechanics. She found a way to prove it empirically. Suddenly, all of their devices activated simultaneously. The old equipment in the room hummed to life, displays flickering with familiar patterns. The strange music they had heard in the tunnels grew stronger, resolving into a clear harmonic sequence that made the air itself seem to shimmer. "Look at this," Vesper called out, pointing to a specific sequence of equations. She found a way to use quantum entanglement to store and retrieve information from the quantum field itself, not just data, actual consciousness. Lysander felt his scientific skepticism warring with what he was witnessing. "Are you saying she found a way to communicate across the boundary of death itself?" "Not exactly," came a voice from the tunnel entrance. They turned to see Dr. Theron Nightshade standing there, flanked by two men in dark suits. "She found something far more valuable, a way to prove that consciousness is fundamental to the universe itself, that what religions call the soul is actually a quantifiable, measurable phenomenon." "Theron," Professor Ambrose said quietly, "you knew about this place all along, didn't you?" "Of course," Nightshade replied, stepping into the chamber. "We've been monitoring Elena's research for years, even after her unfortunate accident. We knew someone would eventually follow her trail, though I must admit, I didn't expect it to be her own husband who would lead us here." The harmonics in the room intensified, and the quantum readings began to spike dramatically. Lysander felt something shift in the air around them, a presence that was both familiar and impossible. "You killed her," he said, the truth finally crystallizing in his mind. "When she refused to give you her research, you sabotaged her lab." Nightshade smiled coldly. "Think of the implications, Lysander. Proof of life after death, the ability to communicate with consciousness stored in the quantum field, the power to bridge science and spirituality. It's worth far more than one scientist's life." But something was happening in the chamber. The equations on the walls seemed to be glowing with their own light, and the harmonic frequencies were building towards some kind of crescendo. Astria's eyes widened as she looked at her readings. "The quantum field is collapsing," she gasped. Or, no, it's not collapsing. It's opening. The air in the center of the room began to shimmer and distort, forming patterns that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the human eye could process. And through it all, Lysander felt something he hadn't felt in years, the unmistakable presence of Elena. They were about to witness something that would bridge the gap between science and faith in a way that none of them could have anticipated. The truth Elena had died protecting was about to reveal itself, and nothing in their understanding of reality would ever be the same. The underground chamber had become a nexus of impossible phenomena. Equations glowed on the walls with an inner light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the quantum harmonics, while the shimmering distortion in the center of the room grew more defined with each passing moment. Dr. Theron Nightshade and his men stood transfixed, their plans for seizing control momentarily forgotten in the face of something far beyond their understanding. "The quantum field isn't just opening," Zephyr announced, his voice trembling as he read the measurements. "It's organizing itself into a coherent pattern. These readings, they're identical to human brainwave patterns, but at a quantum scale." Lysander felt it before he saw it, a presence so familiar it made his heart ache. The shimmering in the center of the room began to coalesce into a form that shouldn't have been possible, yet was undeniably there. It was like watching thoughts become reality, consciousness taking shape through pure mathematics. "Elena," he whispered, and the name seemed to ripple through the quantum field itself. The form became clearer, not quite physical but more than mere light, a pattern of energy that held Elena's consciousness, her essence. Her presence filled the chamber with a tangible warmth that even the hardened scientists couldn't deny. "Remarkable," Nightshade breathed, his mask of cold authority cracking. "The perfect fusion of quantum mechanics and consciousness. She actually did it." But Professor Ambrose was moving quickly, his aged hands flying over Elena's equipment with surprising dexterity. "This isn't just about witnessing," he said urgently. "Elena built this chamber for a reason. The harmonics, the equations, they're all part of a larger message." Astria was already ahead of him, her fingers dancing across her tablet as she correlated the glowing equations with Elena's research notes. "It's a quantum encryption key," she exclaimed. "The patterns we're seeing, they're not just proving consciousness survives death. They're showing us how consciousness is fundamental to the structure of reality itself." The air crackled with energy as Elena's consciousness became more focused. The quantum harmonics shifted, forming themselves into clear mathematical sequences that wrote themselves in light across the chamber walls. Lysander found himself understanding at levels that went beyond mere comprehension. It was as if the knowledge was being written directly into his consciousness. "The universe isn't just governed by physical laws," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "Consciousness isn't an emergent property of matter. It's the other way around. Matter, energy, space, time. They're all expressions of a fundamental conscious field that underlies everything." "The divine algorithm," Reverend Cassian breathed, his theological training finding unexpected resonance with the scientific revelation unfolding before them. Not just a metaphor, but a literal description of how consciousness shapes reality. Dr. Vesper Halcyon was frantically documenting everything, her scientific skepticism warring with the undeniable evidence before her. "The implications are staggering. This doesn't just prove the existence of life after death, it completely redefines our understanding of what life and consciousness actually are." But Nightshade was recovering from his initial awe, his ambition reasserting itself. "Think of the applications," he said, his voice hard. "Whoever controls this technology could literally reshape reality itself. The military implications alone." "No!" The word echoed through the chamber with quantum force as Elena's presence intensified. The harmonics shifted, becoming almost musical in their complexity. Through their connection, Lysander understood what she was trying to tell them. "This isn't about control," he said, facing Nightshade. "It's about understanding. Elena didn't discover this to give anyone power over reality. She discovered it to show us that consciousness, love, what some call the divine, it's all real, all fundamental to the universe itself. We're not just observing the cosmos, we're part of its ongoing creation." The quantum readings were approaching levels that threatened to overwhelm their instruments. Professor Ambrose worked quickly, adjusting settings on Elena's equipment. "The field is becoming unstable," he warned. "We can't maintain this connection for long." But Nightshade had drawn a weapon, his face twisted with frustrated ambition. "Nobody is leaving until we've secured this technology. The potential is too great to—" He never finished the sentence. The quantum harmonics peaked, and for a moment everyone in the chamber experienced consciousness as Elena had discovered it. Not limited to their physical bodies, but connected to everything. Part of a vast, living field of awareness that permeated all of reality. In that moment, they understood what Elena had died protecting. The knowledge that science and spirituality were never truly separate, that the deepest mysteries of existence could be approached through either lens, but had to be understood through both. The weapon fell from Nightshade's nerveless fingers as he staggered, overwhelmed by the experience. His men seemed equally affected, their trained aggression dissolving in the face of a reality far greater than they had imagined. "Elena found the bridge," Lysander said softly as the harmonics began to fade. "Not just between life and death, but between the physical and the spiritual, between science and faith. She showed us that they're all part of the same truth." The glowing equations began to fade, but not before Astria and Zephyr had documented everything. The shimmering form of Elena's consciousness grew dimmer, but her presence remained, transformed into understanding that each of them would carry forward. "The truth can't be controlled or suppressed," Professor Ambrose said, looking at Nightshade with mixture of pity and understanding. "It can only be discovered again and again by those ready to see it." As the chamber returned to normal, they all knew that nothing would ever be the same. Elena's discovery wouldn't just reshape scientific understanding or religious doctrine. It would fundamentally change how humanity saw itself and its place in the cosmos. The great debate between science and faith had not ended, but transformed into something new, a recognition that both were essential lenses for understanding a reality far more mysterious and meaningful than either alone could describe. The ascent from the underground chamber felt like emerging from a dream into a changed world. Sunlight streamed through the celestial observatory's windows, impossibly bright and ordinary after what they had witnessed below. Dr. Theron Nightshade and his men followed quietly, their earlier threats dissolved in the face of an experience that had shaken their very understanding of reality. Lysander's hands trembled as he carefully packed Elena's research materials. Each page now held new meaning, not just as scientific documentation, but as a love letter to understanding itself. A bridge between the measurable and the infinite that she had sacrificed everything to build. "The media is still outside, Doctor," Vesper Halcyon reported, peering through the observatory's front windows. "They're waiting for answers about yesterday's symposium. They have no idea." "What do we tell them?" Zephyr asked, looking up from his tablet where he was still processing the quantum data they'd recorded. "How do we even begin to explain what we've witnessed?" Professor Ambrose settled into one of the observatory's ancient leather chairs, his aged face serene despite the magnitude of recent events. "Perhaps that's our first test, finding a way to share this knowledge responsibly, in a way that bridges understanding rather than creating more division." Astria was already at work, correlating their findings with both scientific principles and theological concepts. "It's remarkable," she said, looking up from her notes. "Elena's quantum consciousness theory provides mathematical support for ideas that mystics and spiritual leaders have been describing for millennia. The universal field of consciousness, the interconnectedness of all things. It's all there in the equations." Dr. Orion Blackthorne, who had remained unusually quiet since their underground experience, finally spoke. "The scientific community won't accept this easily. It challenges too many fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality." "As does the religious community," Reverend Cassian added thoughtfully. "Many will see it as an attempt to reduce divine mystery to mathematical equations." "They're both missing the point," Lysander said, his voice stronger now. "Elena wasn't trying to prove one perspective right and another wrong. She was showing us that our different ways of understanding reality, scientific, spiritual, philosophical, are all glimpses of a greater truth that encompasses them all." Nightshade, who had been standing by the window lost in thought, turned to face the group. "I owe you all an apology," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I was so focused on the potential power of Elena's discovery that I missed its true significance. What we experienced down there, it changes everything." The morning sun had risen fully now, filling the observatory with golden light that seemed to make the brass instruments glow. Outside, the media crews were starting to stir, preparing for another day of coverage. "We need a plan," Vesper said practically. "Not just for handling the media, but for sharing Elena's discovery in a way that honors its true meaning." Professor Ambrose nodded, reaching for his cane as he stood. "I suggest we begin with the symposium audience. They've already witnessed something inexplicable. They're prepared for a deeper explanation. But first," Lysander interjected, "I need to make something right." He turned to face the assembled group, his eyes clear and determined. "Yesterday, I stood before an audience and denounced the possibility of anything beyond our current scientific understanding. Today, I need to stand before them again and share what Elena helped us discover. That the universe is far more mysterious and meaningful than our limited perspectives suggest." Astria looked up from her work, her face bright with sudden inspiration. "What if we don't just tell them? What if we show them? Elena's equipment could be modified to demonstrate the quantum consciousness effect on a smaller scale, not as dramatic as what we experienced underground, but enough to provide empirical evidence." Zephyr was already running calculations on his tablet. "It's possible. The harmonics could be replicated under controlled conditions. We'd need to be careful about the power levels, but—" "No more hiding," Lysander said firmly. "No more treating science and spirituality as opposing forces. Elena gave her life to show us that truth is bigger than our divisions. We owe it to her to share that understanding with the world. As they began to plan their presentation, something remarkable happened. The quantum sensors they had brought up from the chamber began registering familiar patterns, subtle but unmistakable harmonics that suggested Elena's consciousness was still with them, not as dramatically as in the chamber, but as a gentle reminder of the larger reality they had glimpsed. "She's showing us something else," Professor Ambrose said softly, watching the readings. "The connection she discovered, it's not limited to special equipment or underground chambers. It's everywhere all the time. We just need to learn how to perceive it." Reverend Cassian smiled, a look of deep understanding crossing his face. "Like learning to see the stars that are always there, even in daylight. They don't vanish with the dawn. We just need different tools and perspectives to recognize their presence." As the morning progressed, they worked together to prepare for what would become a historic presentation. Scientists and spiritual leaders, skeptics and believers, all had been transformed by their experience, and all were now united in the task of sharing a truth that transcended their former divisions. The media crews outside had no idea that they were about to document something far more significant than a scientific controversy. They were about to witness the beginning of a new understanding, one that would challenge humanity to grow beyond its limited perspectives and embrace a larger vision of reality itself. The main auditorium of the Helios Institute hummed with anticipation. Word had spread quickly through academic circles about another unprecedented presentation, and the room was filled beyond capacity. Scientists, religious leaders, journalists, and curious members of the public sat shoulder to shoulder, all waiting to hear what Dr. Lysander Ravencroft would say after the inexplicable events of the previous days. At the back of the stage, Lysander stood quietly as Zephyr and Astria made final adjustments to Elena's modified equipment. The quantum harmonics generators had been carefully calibrated, powerful enough to demonstrate the consciousness effect but not so strong as to overwhelm the unprepared audience. "The frequencies are stable," Zephyr reported, his young face showing both excitement and nervousness. "We're ready whenever you are." Professor Ambrose approached, placing a gentle hand on Lysander's shoulder. "Remember, you're not just presenting scientific findings today. You're sharing a truth that could help heal the divide between science and faith." Dr. Vesper Halcyon was managing the press, carefully screening questions and ensuring the more sensitive aspects of their discovery would be presented responsibly. "The mainstream scientific journals are already calling this potential pseudoscience," she warned. "We need to be precise in our demonstration." "Let them be skeptical," Lysander replied, a small smile playing at his lips. "I was the biggest skeptic of all, remember? Sometimes the truth has to be experienced to be understood." As the lights dimmed and the audience settled, Reverend Cassian took his place in the front row alongside other religious leaders. Their presence was a powerful symbol of the bridge that Elena's work had begun to build. Dr. Orion Blackthorne, who had become an unexpected ally, stood near the emergency exits with security personnel. After the incident with Nightshade, they weren't taking any chances. The man himself was now in custody. His ambitions for weaponizing the discovery halted before they could begin. Lysander stepped to the podium, and a hush fell over the audience. The same people who had watched him denounce faith just days ago now waited to hear how he would explain his dramatic reversal. "2 days ago, I stood before many of you and claimed to have proof that science had eliminated the need for faith," he began, his voice steady and clear. "I was wrong. Not just about faith, but about the very nature of science itself." He gestured to the complex array of equipment behind him. "My late wife, Dr. Elena Ravencroft, made a discovery that changes everything we thought we knew about consciousness, quantum mechanics, and the fundamental nature of reality. Today, we're going to share that discovery with you." Astria stepped forward, pulling up detailed diagrams on the massive screens. "What you're seeing are quantum field measurements that demonstrate consciousness isn't just an emergent property of brain activity. It's a fundamental force of the universe itself, as essential as gravity or electromagnetism." The audience stirred as the implications began to sink in. Lysander continued, "Elena found a way to prove that what many traditions call the soul The spirit or divine consciousness isn't separate from scientific reality. It's the foundation of it. He nodded to Zephyr, who activated the harmonic generators. A subtle vibration filled the auditorium as the quantum field became more perceptible to human consciousness. The effect was gentle but unmistakable, a sense of expanded awareness that many in the audience would later struggle to describe. "What you're feeling now is just a fraction of what Elena discovered," Lysander explained. "The quantum field that pervades all space and time isn't just a mathematical construct. It's the medium of consciousness itself. When we observe quantum phenomena, we're not just measuring reality, we're participating in its ongoing creation." The sensors around the auditorium began displaying readings that confirmed what the audience was experiencing. Patterns emerged that couldn't be explained by known physical laws alone. Patterns that suggested conscious intention affecting quantum probability at a macro scale. Professor Ambrose stepped forward to add historical context. Throughout human history, mystics and scientists have been describing the same reality from different perspectives. Elena's work provides the mathematical framework that unifies these understandings. As he spoke, the harmonics reached a crucial frequency, and something remarkable happened. The quantum field became visible to the naked eye, subtle patterns of light and energy that danced through the air, responding to the collective consciousness of the audience. Gasps of wonder filled the auditorium. Scientists reached for their instruments while religious leaders whispered prayers of amazement. The barrier between the measurable and the miraculous was dissolving before their eyes. "This is not a rejection of science," Lysander emphasized, his voice thick with emotion. "It's an expansion of it." Elena showed us that true understanding comes not from choosing between science and faith, but from recognizing that they're both essential aspects of how we perceive and interact with a reality far more wonderful than we imagined. The demonstration continued as Astria and Zephyr presented detailed data correlating quantum consciousness effects with both scientific principles and religious experiences. The evidence was compelling. Consciousness wasn't just observing reality, it was fundamentally intertwined with its fabric. As the presentation drew to a close, Lysander shared one final insight. Elena's work cost her her life because some wanted to control this knowledge, to use it for power. But the truth she discovered can't be controlled or weaponized. It can only be understood and shared, helping us grow into a deeper appreciation of our place in the cosmos. The audience sat in stunned silence as the harmonics gently faded. The world they had known when they entered the auditorium was not the same world they would return to. A new understanding was dawning, one that would challenge humanity to grow beyond its divisions and embrace a larger vision of reality itself. As questions began to flow from the audience, it was clear that this was just the beginning. Elena's discovery would ripple through human understanding for generations to come, not ending the dialogue between science and faith, but transforming it into something far more profound than either side had imagined possible. The weeks following the historic presentation at the Helios Institute brought changes that rippled through the scientific and religious communities like waves in the quantum field itself. Lysander found himself at the center of a transformation that went far beyond academic discourse. It was reshaping humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmos. The main conference room at the Celestial Observatory had become their de facto headquarters, its walls now covered with a mixture of Elena's equations and responses from institutions around the world. Astria stood before the latest data, her finger tracing patterns that seemed to dance between scientific notation and spiritual significance. "Look at these results," she said, turning to the gathered team. "Research centers globally are replicating our quantum consciousness experiments. The effect is consistent. Consciousness isn't just observing reality, it's participating in its fundamental creation." Zephyr looked up from his tablet, where he was coordinating with international research teams. "The Vatican's scientific advisors have officially endorsed our findings," he reported with a hint of amazement. "They're calling it empirical evidence of the divine spark within creation itself." Professor Ambrose sat in his familiar chair by the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that seemed more vibrant since their discovery. Elena would be pleased, he said softly. Not because she was proven right, but because people are finally beginning to understand what she always saw, the profound unity underlying all our ways of knowing. Lysander stood at the observation dome, his hand resting on Elena's old telescope. The instrument had taken on new meaning now, not just as a tool for observing distant stars, but as a symbol of humanity's evolving perspective on existence itself. "We're getting requests for interviews from every major media outlet," Dr. Vesper Halcyon announced, entering the room with a stack of papers. "Scientific journals, religious publications, philosophy quarterlies. Everyone wants to understand how this changes their field." "And the resistance?" Lysander asked, turning from the telescope. "What about those who claim we're destroying either science or religion?" Reverend Cassian, who had become a regular presence in their discussions, smiled gently. "There will always be those who prefer the comfort of rigid boundaries to the challenge of broader understanding, but the evidence speaks for itself, particularly to those who experience the quantum consciousness effect firsthand." The effect he referred to had become impossible to ignore. As more people learned to recognize and interact with the quantum field consciously, reports were coming in of experiences that bridged the physical and spiritual in unprecedented ways. Scientists were documenting quantifiable changes in quantum probability patterns influenced by conscious intention, while religious leaders reported deeper, more tangible connections to what they had previously known only through faith. Dr. Orion Blackthorne entered the room, his former academic rivalry with Lysander transformed into genuine collaboration. "The peer review board has finished their analysis," he announced. "Elena's quantum consciousness theorem has been formally accepted. It's going to revolutionize every field from physics to neuroscience. And beyond," added Astria, pulling up new data on the main screen. "Look at these applications in medicine, psychology, environmental science. When we account for consciousness as a fundamental force rather than an emergent property, entire fields of study transform." The implications were staggering. Hospitals were reporting unexplainable improvements in patient outcomes when treatment was combined with conscious quantum field interaction. Environmental scientists were discovering ways to detect and potentially heal ecosystem damage through focused consciousness. Even technology was evolving as engineers began incorporating quantum consciousness principles into their designs. "Dr. Nightshade's hearing is next week," Vesper reminded them quietly. "They want you to testify, Lysander." Lysander nodded, feeling no anger toward the man who had contributed to Elena's death. The quantum consciousness effect had shown them all that carrying hatred only limited one's connection to the larger field of awareness that united all existence. "I'll speak about Elena's work," he said, "about its true purpose and potential. Perhaps even Nightshade can understand now that real power lies not in controlling knowledge, but in sharing understanding." Professor Ambrose stood slowly, leaning on his cane as he approached the center of the room. "We're standing at a threshold," he said, his voice carrying the weight of wisdom. "Elena's discovery isn't just changing what we know, it's changing how we know, how we understand our role in the cosmic dance of creation." The quantum sensors that now ran continuously in the observatory registered a subtle shift in the field, a harmonic pattern that had become familiar. Elena's consciousness, while no longer manifesting as dramatically as it had in the underground chamber, remained a gentle presence in the quantum field, a reminder of the larger reality they were all part of. Lysander touched the wedding ring he still wore, feeling both the loss and the profound connection that transcended physical separation. Elena used to say that the universe isn't just stranger than we imagine, it's stranger than we can imagine. But she also believed that our capacity for understanding could grow, that we could learn to see more of the mystery while maintaining our wonder at it. As night fell over the observatory, the team continued their work, each contributing to a new chapter in human understanding. The old barriers between science and spirituality were dissolving, not into chaos, but into a more profound and inclusive way of knowing. Outside, the stars emerged one by one, their light traveling across vast distances to reach human eyes and instruments. But now, Thanks to Elena's discovery, they understood that the true connection between observer and observed, between consciousness and cosmos, was both more immediate and more mysterious than anyone had imagined. The transformation that had begun with one scientist's public denunciation of God had become something far greater, a bridge between ways of knowing that had too long been kept apart, and a doorway to understanding that would continue to unfold for generations to come. 1 year after the events at the Celestial Observatory, the landscape of human knowledge had been irrevocably transformed. The Great Hall of Astralgate University was filled to capacity as Lysander Ravencroft prepared to deliver the first annual Elena Ravencroft Memorial Lecture on quantum consciousness studies. The audience represented a new kind of intellectual gathering. Scientists sat beside religious leaders, philosophers next to physicists, all united in their pursuit of understanding that transcended traditional boundaries. The integration of quantum consciousness studies into mainstream academia had created new fields of research and collaboration that would have seemed impossible just a year ago. Professor Ambrose, now director of the newly established Elena Ravencroft Institute for Consciousness Studies, sat in the front row. Despite his advanced age, his eyes sparkled with the same enthusiasm that had guided generations of students toward deeper understanding. Beside him, Zephyr and Astria had grown into respected researchers in their own right, their work expanding on Elena's foundational discoveries. Lysander stood at the podium, looking out over the assembled crowd. The past year had aged him, but not in the way grief once had. There was a depth to his presence now, a harmony between the precise scientist he had always been and the broader understanding he had gained. "A year ago," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "I stood before an audience much like this one and claimed to have disproven the possibility of divine presence in our universe. Today, I stand before you with a far greater truth, that consciousness itself, what some call the divine and others call awareness, is woven into the very fabric of reality." The quantum sensors that had become standard equipment in major institutions registered a familiar harmonic pattern. Many in the audience had learned to recognize these signatures of consciousness in the quantum field, a skill that was rapidly becoming as fundamental as reading or mathematics. "Elena's work," Lysander continued, "has given us more than new equations or theories. It has given us a new way of seeing ourselves and our place in the cosmos. We now understand that consciousness isn't just an observer of reality. It's an active participant in the ongoing creation of the universe itself." Dr. Vesper Halcyon, now heading the International Committee on Quantum Consciousness Ethics, nodded in agreement from her seat. Her work ensuring the responsible development of these discoveries had become as crucial as the research itself. "In the past year," Lysander said, "we've seen applications of Elena's discovery that none of us could have predicted. Hospitals reporting miraculous recoveries through quantum consciousness integration. Environmental scientists developing new ways to heal damaged ecosystems. Technological breakthroughs that merge human awareness with quantum computing in ways we're only beginning to understand." He paused, touching the simple gold band he still wore. "But perhaps the most profound change has been in how we understand ourselves. The artificial boundaries we created between science and spirituality, between reason and faith, are dissolving into a more complete way of knowing." The quantum field harmonics strengthened slightly, and those sensitive to them felt Elena's familiar presence, not as a dramatic manifestation, but as a gentle reminder of the larger reality they were all part of. "We stand at the beginning of a new chapter in human understanding," Lysander continued. "Elena showed us the door, but it's up to all of us to walk through it together, to explore this broader reality with both scientific rigor and spiritual openness." In the audience, Dr. Theron Nightshade sat quietly. After serving his sentence, he had dedicated himself to ensuring that consciousness research was used for the benefit of all humanity, not for power or control. His transformation was itself a testament to the change Elena's discovery had initiated. As Lysander concluded his lecture, he shared a final thought that brought tears to many eyes. "Elena used to say that the greatest mysteries of existence aren't solved by choosing between different ways of knowing, but by learning to see through multiple lenses at once. Today, we're not just observing the universe, we're awakening to our role as conscious participants in its unfolding wonder. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for Lysander or Elena, but for a new understanding that had begun to heal ancient divisions and open new possibilities for human knowledge and growth. Later that evening, as the stars emerged above the celestial observatory, Lysander stood with his colleagues, no, his friends, watching the quantum field patterns dance in their instruments. The universe, they had learned, was far more mysterious and meaningful than any of them had imagined, and they were just beginning to understand their place within it. Elena would be proud, Professor Ambrose said softly, standing beside him. Not because she was proven right, but because humanity is finally learning to see what she always saw, the profound unity of all things. Lysander smiled, feeling both the weight and the wonder of their ongoing journey. The scientist who had once denounced God had found something far greater than either blind faith or rigid skepticism. He had found a truth that encompassed and transcended both. As the quantum harmonics played their eternal symphony, Lysander knew that this wasn't an ending, but a beginning. Humanity was taking its first steps into a larger understanding of reality, one that would continue to unfold in ways that would amaze and inspire generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.